Alright, now we're going to drape the circle skirt. This is going to start off by, just like we did with the basic skirt, and we're going to start off by lining up our selvage, the edge of our selvage, so the length grain, with our center front. So let's go ahead and line up our fabric, and make sure to give yourself a good 3 inches or so above waistline for this. And we're going to lock in right at center front and waist. Just pin this fabric right here to hold it in place. And there we go. Okay. Now I'm just going to line up my center front, or sorry, my selvage, the edge of my selvage, with my center front, locking in my length grain parallel to my center front. Like so. And I'll just pin this about every 3 or 4 inches down to the bottom of the form, like so. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pin over to my princess seam, like so. And I'm going to clip right down into that point. So actually I'll lock it in, like so. And then I'll take my scissors and I'm going to lock, and I'm going to just snip right down to that point. Okay? Now what I can do is I'm going to pivot in some fullness into my muslin, just like that. Okay? And that fullness is coming right from this point where we locked it in at princess seam and pivoted it in. Okay? I'm doing about 1 inch here at my hip line. That's what I'm paying attention to. Okay? So now what I want to do is lock in that fullness. So at hip line, I'm just going to put a pin on this side of that fullness and on this side as well, just to keep it in place. Alright, and then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to measure over about 1 inch from this first point of origin. So I'm measuring over 1 inch and just marking out my waistline about 1 inch over. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and lock in right at the waist, about 1 inch over. And I'm going to clip right down into that point, like so. And I'm going to pivot in another inch or so fullness into my fabric, into my skirt. Okay. Let's hold that right there. And I'm going to lock in that fullness as well, right at hip line. And I'm going to repeat. Again, I'm going to measure over about 1 inch from this point. And I will lock in right at waist. Like so. And I'm going to snip down through that muslin to that point. And I'm going to pivot in about another inch. Okay. There we go. And we'll lock that in. There we are. Let's go ahead and measure over our next inch. This should bring us to right about side seam or close to it. Lock in at waist. Clip right down into that point. And then pivot in. Okay? What we want to be able to do, we'll pivot in that about inch, and if we did it correctly, we should be at cross grain at side seam. So here's my side seam right here, and I can see I'm actually right at cross grain. So let's go ahead and lock this in right at side seam and at the hip line. And so I locked it in at hip line. at side seam, and I'm just going to smooth up to my waist. Like so, and I'm just locking it in or pinning it up all the way to intersection of my waist and side seam, and then I'm going to do the same thing going down. To about the bottom of the form. There we go. Okay, so now we've draped the front half of our circle skirt. Let's go ahead and transfer some of this information from our form to our drape. I'm going to transfer my waistline. So again, if you have a large or wide piece of twill at your waist, either pick the top or the bottom to be the true waist. I'm picking the top. And so I'm marking that all the way around to side seam. Let's mark our side seam from waist down. There we go. And we're also going to mark our hip line. So starting at center front, mark our hip line. Right around the side seam. There we go. Okay, and we'll label our center front. There's our center front. All right, so we've now draped and marked the front of our circle skirt. Let's go ahead and do the back. First thing I'm going to do is unpin here at side seam and just move these pins out of the way. I'm kind of locking that fullness in too as I do it. And then I can even pin here, and I can just roll over that muslin so side seam is now exposed. We'll get our back. Okay, so let's go ahead and start draping the back of the circle skirt. Again, we want to leave ourselves about a good 3 or 4 inches above our waist, and I'm going to line up the back of my the back of my selvage, or the selvage with my center back, and pin that right in the intersection of center back and waist. And I'll just pin this in place so it doesn't move. Okay, so I'm lining up the edge of my selvage, my link grain with my center back, and I'm going to pin down center back about every 3 or 4 inches, holding that in place. Okay, I'm going to come up the waist and I'm going to smooth over to my princess seam, which is right about there. And I'm going to lock that in place. Open this. And I'm going to come over to hip line. And I'll smooth over to a little before princess seam, maybe an inch or so before it. Princess seam's here. Lock that in there. And I'm going to go ahead and clip down right into that first set of pins, right in between them. And I'm going to pivot in about an inch or so of fullness right at my hip line. There we go. And I'm going to lock that in place. I'm then going to measure over an inch on my waistline from where that first fullness is being pivoted in. And I'm going to mark at my waist about an inch over right there. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to lock that in. right at the waist. And I'm going to go ahead and clip down right into that point. Go. And then pivot in about another inch or so of fullness. And lock it in at the hip line. Measure over another inch. Lock that in at waist. Go ahead and clip down into there. And then pivot in about another inch or so of fullness right there at the hip. Lock that in. And now we're going to measure over another inch, which should bring me right to side seam, which it does, so I don't even need to mark it. So there's my side seam right there. Let's go ahead and lock it in at waist. And snip. And if we did it correctly, it should bring us right to cross grain at our side seam, which it does. So let's go ahead and lock that in. There we are. Okay, so there's the back draped. Now we need to join the front and back side seams together. I'm going to go ahead and, starting at hip line, I'm going to mark or connect the two right through all layers as if I'm sewing the two together. Okay, so I've pinned through both layers, and I'll pin right up to my waist. Be careful not to pull too tight. Should just be resting gently against the form. That looks pretty good. And then we're going to pin down from hip line as well. And there we go. Now I can mark side seam on this side, my back side seam, all the way up to the waist and down. Like so. I'm also going to mark my waistline. Center back, and also the hip line. Right to side seam. And then mark or label our center back. Okay, we've now draped the entire circle skirt from front to back. It's now ready to be removed from the form, laid flat, and perfected.